It happened just before sunrise at 5:43 a.m. A trembling voice broke across the national broadcaster, CRTV. There was no anthem, no official ceremony, just a tight-faced military spokesperson reading from a single sheet of paper. The President of the Republic, Paul Biya, is no longer in command. The armed forces have taken control in the name of national survival. Cameroonian sovereignty begins now. Then silence. No explanation. No footage. No Biya. The signal cut to black. For a moment, the country froze. Then, as the sun rose over Yaoundé, Cameroon woke up in a different reality. The man who had ruled them for more than 40 years, who had outlived coups, outmaneuvered rivals, and vanished for months while governing from foreign hospitals, was gone. Whispers spread fast. Is it real? Is Biya dead? Who's in charge now? By 7 a.m., armored vehicles surrounded the Etudi presidential palace. Black SUVs pulled into the Ministry of Defense. Airport traffic halted. Key generals were nowhere to be seen. And the people, they came pouring into the streets, not with fear, but with tears, laughter, and trembling hope. In Douala, crowds gathered around phone screens, watching replays of the announcement like it was a dream. In Bamenda, church bells rang unprompted. In Bafoussam, school children chanted, 50 years, we were not born, now we walk free. Older men wept openly. Women dropped to their knees in prayer. For decades, Paul Biya had seemed eternal. A shadow stretched across generations, a ghost behind every decision, every lost opportunity, every broken promise. But now the shadow was gone. No gunshots, no fire, just a country waking up from a half-century coma. A quiet coup, a loud miracle, and somewhere in the halls of silence, the world began to ask, if Paul Biya can fall, who's next? It didn't happen overnight. It only looked that way. Behind the silence, months of planning had unfolded under the radar. A slow, precise unraveling of Africa's oldest dictatorship. The architects of the coup weren't rebels from the forest or foreign-backed plotters. They were Biya's own generals, men who had worn his insignia for decades and had finally had enough. At the center of it all was Brigadier General Ano Mbasai, head of internal military logistics, and for the past year, the man Biya trusted to manage presidential security. But trust had run dry. The real breaking point came in Geneva, where Biya had spent months hospitalized under French surveillance. According to leaked cables, while Cameroonians struggle with food inflation, separatist violence, and mass youth unemployment, the president's medical bills crossed $1.4 million in just 3 months. We are guarding a ghost, one officer muttered. And they were. For most of 2024, Paul Biya hadn't stepped foot inside a government building. Decisions were made by a closed circle of old men, nephews, distant cousins, French consultants, while 80% of the country's population lived under the age of 35. Inside the military, something shifted. Younger officers, loyal to Cameroon, not to Biya's legacy, began building bridges. Unit by unit, they won hearts. One colonel secured the 3rd Armored Division. Another coordinated blackout drills with Air Force pilots. And then, silently, the palace guard switched sides. The coup was greenlit at 3:17 a.m. with a single encrypted text. Lurido Tom. The curtain falls. By 4 a.m., Biya's communications team was detained. By 5 a.m., the state broadcaster was under full military control. By 5:43, the world knew. No blood. No chaos, just surgical precision. When the sun rose over Yaoundé, power had changed hands, not with gunfire, but with discipline. The old dictator hadn't just been removed. He had been replaced by silence. And silence in Cameroon had never felt so loud. In the end, Paul Biya wasn't overthrown by rebels, foreigners, or exiles. He was brought down by something far more dangerous, those who knew him best. The betrayal came from inside his own palace, from men who had eaten at his table, sworn loyalty at his feet, and guarded his life through 2 generations of power. At the heart of betrayal was Sergeant Didier Kiel, a quiet, disciplined bodyguard who had stood outside Biya's presidential suite for over a decade. But what Biya never knew was this. Didier's father had once been jailed for criticizing the regime. His uncle had died in the Anglophone crisis. His younger brother had been shot during a protest in Douala. To Didier, it was just another uniform, but to the movement rising beneath the surface, he was the key. It was Didier who mapped the palace's shift changes, who identified which guards were ready to defect, who opened the back gates at 3:04 a.m. to let in the Special Forces team without a sound. He didn't fire a single bullet, but his fingerprints were on the fall of a king, and he wasn't alone. Generals who had once suppressed protests now passed USB drives to the Transitional Council. Cabinet secretaries leaked internal memos detailing how billions were funneled into French banks. Even Biya's personal physician handed over confidential medical files proving the president had been clinically unfit to govern for over 18 months. We weren't plotting a coup, one insider later confessed. We were correcting a national coma. By the time the palace was surrounded, there was no one left to defend Biya. No last stand, no loyalist charge. Just a man too old to flee, too isolated to fight, and too late to understand that even silence can betray. One junior officer reportedly whispered as Biya was escorted out, "We protected you for 50 years. You forgot to protect us for even one." It started with a single scream in Yaoundé's Mbagimbi market. "Else party, he's gone." And then the streets exploded. Within minutes, thousands were running through alleyways barefoot, waving flags, crying, praying, screaming. Old men climbed onto rooftops. Children beat empty cans like drums. Mothers who had lost sons to protest in silence wept and fell to their knees. Paul Biya, the man who ruled for nearly half a century, had finally fallen. In Douala, spontaneous parades shut down the city. Motorcycles formed convoys flying Cameroon's national flag upside down, a symbol of rebirth. In Bamenda, where the Anglophone conflict had left bullet holes and broken families, a silence hung in the air before a sudden eruption of clapping and shouting. "He's gone. He's finally gone." At the University of Biya, students ripped down old government portraits and replaced them with posters reading, "You can kill a protest, but you can't stop a generation." Even the elderly, long resigned to Biya's eternal rule, stood on their porches watching in disbelief. Some whispered, "I thought I would die before this day." Others just cried. For the first time in decades, no fear hovered over celebration. There were no riot trucks, no water cannons, no soldiers aiming rifles at crowds. The army watched and let it happen. In one viral video, a young protester stood atop a taxi and shouted, "This isn't just a fall of Biya, this is a rise of Cameroon." From that moment on, the streets were no longer filled with people. They were filled with history. And as the night fell, fireworks cracked over Yaoundé. Not organized, not planned, just fire. Spontaneous, chaotic, alive. The sound of a nation breathing freely for the first time in 50 years. At 6:12 a.m. Paris time, a red phone rang in the Élysée Palace. A voice on the line from Yaoundé whispered, "It's done. Biya is no longer in power." There was no resistance. The silence that followed was deafening. For Emmanuel Macron, it wasn't just a regional shift. It was a geopolitical earthquake. Paul Biya had been France's most loyal post-colonial ally. He had opened Cameroon's resources to French corporations. He had signed away infrastructure deals to Total, Ballor, and Orange without contest. He had allowed French troops and intelligence to operate in the shadows, unbothered, unseen. Now, with his fall, Macron's inner circle realized the unthinkable. We just lost our last wall in Central Africa. Within hours, a tight-lipped statement was released by the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. "We are monitoring the situation in Cameroon and urge all parties to maintain peace and constitutional order." But behind the scenes, panic ruled. Inside the French Defense Ministry, urgent reports flowed in. AES leaders were already reaching out to Cameroon's military. Russian diplomatic traffic to Yaoundé had doubled overnight. Massive online support for the coup was trending across West Africa. France's image as the stabilizer was crumbling. One military advisor reportedly shouted during a closed-door session, "If Cameroon joins the ES or expels our bases, we lose the entire Gulf of Guinea." At Total Energy's HQ, stockholders demanded emergency meetings. Billions in resource deals now stood on the edge of nationalization. France's real fear wasn't just Biya's fall. It was the precedent. If the longest ruling puppet in Africa could be cut down by his own soldiers, what about Togo? What about Congo? What about Chad? Macron was advised to reach out to the Transitional Military Council. He hesitated. There was no face left to trust in Yaoundé. Meanwhile, African youth across the continent were sending a different message. We don't want France's fear. We want our future. And in the streets of Paris, small groups of young Africans gathered quietly, waving Cameroon's flag, singing Le Vieux est homme. The old one has fallen. Africa is rising. 2 days after fall, the gates of Atudi Palace creaked open, not to visitors, but to history. Cameroon's new Transitional Military Council granted investigators and auditors access to the presidential archives. What they found was worse than imagined. Biya didn't govern a country, one investigator said. He managed a vault. Hidden behind soundproof doors and biometric locks, they uncovered 3 floors of sealed cabinets, encrypted hard drives, handwritten letters from French and European officials. Inside were contracts that had never passed through Parliament, oil licenses sold to French companies for 1% royalties, timber deals with zero environmental protections, security agreements allowing foreign surveillance bases in the north without public knowledge. But that was just the beginning. One file, stamped confidential, presidential, revealed a secret offshore bank account in Geneva, credited monthly by the Ballor Group, in exchange for monopoly rights over Cameroon's ports. Another showed how millions in international development aid had been rerouted to luxury real estate firms in Paris, all linked to relatives of Biya's inner circle. And then came the letter, dated 2021, signed by Biya himself, addressed to the French president. As long as I live, Cameroon's loyalty to France is guaranteed. My generals are well managed. My people are contained. Just keep the funds moving and silence the critics. The new leaders were stunned. The documents confirmed what many had only whispered. Biya hadn't just ruled for 40 years. He had sold Cameroon, piece by piece, to remain on the throne. Within 48 hours, the Transitional Council released a portion of the files to the public. Redacted, but undeniable. Cameroonians read the truth in disbelief. Young citizens gathered on university steps holding signs. We owe France nothing. Our resources, our rules. Never again. The fall of Biya wasn't just the end of a regime. It was the beginning of a reckoning. And as the world watched, one question rang across the continent. If this is what Biya hid, what are the others still hiding? In the hours following Biya's fall, the continent waited for a voice from ECOWAS, the supposed guardian of regional order, democracy, and stability. But from Abuja to Accra, nothing came. No emergency summit, no condemnation, not even a press release. Behind closed doors, sources confirmed. Internal division had paralyzed the bloc. Nigeria wanted caution. Senegal feared a repeat in Dakar. Ghana remained neutral. The truth? ECOWAS was afraid. Afraid that celebrating Biya's fall would signal approval of military transitions. Afraid that silence would look like weakness. But the people already knew. ECOWAS protects presidents, not citizens. Then, as the silence stretched into embarrassment, another voice cut through. Bold, immediate. AES, the Alliance of Sahel States. Within 24 hours, a joint statement was broadcast from Ouagadougou. The Cameroonian people have spoken through the discipline of their armed forces. We salute the courage of a nation that has reclaimed its sovereignty without foreign permission. Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, now Cameroon. A new axis was forming, one built not on borrowed democracy, but on raw sovereignty. Within days, AES envoys landed in Yaoundé. They met with the Transitional Council behind closed doors. A new memorandum of cooperation was signed: military, economic, digital security. Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim Traoré sent a message to the Cameroonian people. You have broken your chains. Now let us build an Africa that no longer kneels. Across the Sahel, the message echoed loud, one falls for rise. Africa is no longer waiting. Meanwhile, ECOWAS finally broke its silence on day 5 with a brief, awkward statement. We are observing the situation carefully and call for constitutional restoration. But by then, the continent had moved on, because something had shifted. Cameroon, the sleeping giant, had joined the new order, and the old institutions, they were still writing press releases while history was marching on without them. For the first time in half a century, power in Cameroon had no wrinkles. The transitional government, unveiled to thunderous applause on national television, was unlike anything the country had ever seen. No gray-haired ministers from the Biya era, no recycled politicians with French business ties, no hidden hand from Paris. Instead, a new generation stepped forward. The youngest, a 28-year-old civil engineer from Douala, now Deputy Minister of Infrastructure. The head of education, a 33-year-old teacher and protest leader from Biya, once jailed for calling Biya a fossil. The acting spokesperson, a 31-year-old woman fluent in 4 local languages, raised in Garua, known for her viral youth empowerment speeches. Together, they looked like the people they represented, and for the first time, the people listened. This council was not chosen by the West. We are not beholden to old political families. We are not here to manage decay. We are here to rebuild Cameroon from the ground up. Across the nation, hope took physical form. Hospitals opened their gates to patients once turned away without bribes. Teachers returned to classrooms, no longer fearing months of unpaid salaries. Local radio stations aired the voices of poets, youth activists, and traditional leaders without censorship. Even Cameroonians in the diaspora, once silent or ashamed, began booking flights home. In Paris, Brussels, and Toronto, long-exiled intellectuals packed their bags. We didn't leave Cameroon. We left Biya's version of it. Now it's time to return. But not everyone was cheering. Old political elites, cornered, exposed, desperate, began whispering about restoring stability. Some hinted at sabotage. Others fled to France. But the new Cameroon wasn't listening to ghosts. This was a youthquake, and it was spreading in every town. Teenagers painted murals with one word in bold letters: now. Not someday. Not after the next election. Not after another foreign loan. Now. The country belongs to its people again. The images shocked the world. There he was, Paul Biya, once untouchable, once feared, once called the Sphinx of Africa, now frail, hunched, handcuffed, escorted down the marble steps of the Etudi Palace. His signature black sunglasses, gone. His suit, wrinkled. His face, sunken, pale, as if the weight of 50 years had finally crashed down overnight. The footage was not leaked. It was broadcast, intentionally. This is not vengeance, said the Transitional Council. This is history facing itself. For days, Biya had been held under secure house arrest in a private wing of the military hospital in Yaoundé. He had not spoken publicly. But inside those walls, whispers leaked out. According to aides, he still asked for his French advisors. He demanded his morning espresso be flown in from Geneva. He refused to watch the news. But the palace he once ruled had become a relic. His portraits, once in every school, every courtroom, every passport, were being torn down by students across the nation. He's a ghost now, one teenager said, holding a faded ID card with Biya's photo. A ghost we're learning to live without. International media speculated on his fate. Would he be exiled to France? Tried in Cameroon? Protected by some secret deal? But the council was firm. There will be no escape. There will be no exile. For crimes committed on our soil, there will be due process. Because justice is not revenge. It's closure. In a symbolic gesture, Biya's last presidential vehicle, a bulletproof black Mercedes, was put on display in a museum exhibit titled The Cost of Silence. Across Africa, people watched and gasped. Because this wasn't just a fall of a man, it was a fall of a myth. That power lasts forever. That leaders can never be touched. That Africa bows to age, not accountability. And as Biya sat alone in a guarded hospital room, The chants outside his former palace grew louder by the day. Never again. No more kings. Cameroon has awakened. When Paul Biya fell, a wall didn't just crack in Cameroon. A dam burst across an entire continent. In Libreville, graffiti appeared overnight. Cameroon did it. Who's next? In Lomé, students marched in silence, fists raised, holding placards that read, "We are not afraid of our history anymore." In Kinshasa, a viral video showed a mother saying to her teenage son, "What your grandfather dreamed of, you might live to see." The fall of Africa's longest ruling dictator was more than a political event. It was a spiritual rupture. For decades, people had lived under the weight of names that wouldn't move. Biya, Museveni, and Gesso, Nkurunziza, Ngema. Leaders who became institutions. Presidents who became permanent. But now one had fallen, and the people had won. Suddenly, everything felt possible. Pro-democracy youth movements reignited across the continent. Hashtags trended from Abuja to Nairobi. Hashtag no more life presidents. Hashtag Africa decides. Hashtag Biya was the beginning. In Addis Ababa, a quiet shift occurred at the African Union. Delegates began to speak more boldly about term limits, transitions, and sovereignty. Even diaspora communities felt it. In London, Paris, New York, young Africans danced in the streets. Cameroon's flag wrapped around their shoulders like a new skin. And in the villages where internet signals barely reached, elders gathered around radios, listening to the soft, steady voices of a generation saying, "We are not waiting anymore." Inside Cameroon, the new leaders called for a national day of reflection. No fireworks, no military parade, just a quiet moment at sunrise where the country stood still and remembered the silence, the fear, the stolen decades. And then they looked forward. Africa is not broken, one speaker said. Africa was silenced, and now she's speaking. The fall of Biya wasn't just the end of an era. It was the sound of a continent waking up,